There we. Steve about clapped at me. Oh my goodness. All right. It is good to see everybody out today. I appreciate y'all braving the cold and coming on out. It's hey sis. It's good when we come out to the house of the Lord in circumstances that are not ideal. You know, it's good when we come out and the sun's shining and the birds are singing and the car starts right away and the air conditioner works or the heater works and the radio station is playing the perfect tunes and it's just a joy to come to church and we walk in and everybody's happy. That's a good thing. But it's also a good thing when you go out and the battery's dead, or you start down the road and you have to stop and change a tire, or you get to church and you just trip coming up the steps. You know, it's also good when we push through circumstances in life and continue to do what God has called us to do. And one of the things that God has called us to do is go to church. God has said to us to not forsake the assembling of the brethren as the manner of some is. And I want to congratulate y'all for doing just that, for not forsaking the assembly of the brethren. It's important when we gather together. Anybody ever have Thanksgiving? Thanksgiving's coming up. Anybody ever do Thanksgiving just by yourself? Yeah? It ain't the same, is it? You got the turkey. You got the jellied cranberry sauce because you just don't want those little hard cranberries. My sister's looking at me really mean right now. You got the stuffing, even if it's out of a box. You got everything there. You can sit down. You can even have the Thanksgiving music playing and have Hallmark Channel on and do all of the stuff. But it just isn't the same as gathering with your family and lifting up your Thanksgivings together. Right? Worship is the same way. I got out on the tractor yesterday bush hogging, and you know, I was worshiping. I was up on the hill, and that's where Dad's altar is, and you can't go on the hill without stopping at the altar. But there was like a big red-tailed hawk that just kept flying around. And no, Becky, it wasn't a buzzard; it was a hawk. I know the difference. And it was there. I could see his red tail, and it's like I was bush hogging, and I look over, and it's right there. Of course, it's way up in the air where it's at, but it's like eye to eye. And there's a time of worship, and it's good. But corporate worship, you know, the Bible also tells us that iron sharpens iron. As iron sharpens, boy, I wish I could talk. As iron sharpens iron, so sharpens you know what I'm trying to say. The countenance of his brother. So does a man sharpen the countenance of his brother. We need each other. We are not islands. Joseph, relating this all back to our lesson today, Joseph had become an island from his family, and not of his own doing. He had been forcefully separated from his family. He had been literally stolen by his brothers, put into a pit with the intention of them coming back and killing him, and then they ended up selling him off to a slaver and literally getting money for their brother. I'm sure that at some point in time we've all considered, if we have siblings, what we could get for them. But they actually followed through with it. And a lot of you are giggling on that. Usually it comes out that it's not worth the hassle, isn't it? It's a good thing, too. That's why I'm still around. But they ended up selling him off. He went into slavery in Egypt. And you all know the story of all of this stuff where he was in Potiphar's house and his wife decided to accuse him because he wouldn't lay with her. And then while he was in prison, he were interpreting the dreams. Then Pharaoh had a dream and he interpreted that dream. And now he has ended up, years later, he's gone from literally a slave boy that was a disposable human being to second in charge to Pharaoh himself. Literally responsible for saving the world as they knew it. with his insight and his guidance from God, he was able to institute a rationing system where for 7 years of great abundance they were able to put back storehouses of grain. And I see you laughing, little Laura. And now they're at a point, after the 7 years of plenty, they're at this point where the famine has kicked in. Come on in, guys, you're fine. The famine has kicked in, and folks are hungry. And they're not just hungry in Egypt, they're hungry. The whole world as they knew it was in a famine. God shut up the rain for 7 years. Now, during the time of Joseph's time of plenty, he was able to institute a program where they would take the grain. The Bible calls it corn. Of course, we know it's not corn like maize. It's corn like grain, any grain. And you know how grain is. It's a hard little dried up grain. It stores. You can put it in a sack. You can put it in a hole in the ground, which is one of the things that they did in Egypt. They were storehouses, if you will, just big pits in the ground, and it was lined with rock, and they would put the grain in there, and as big as this building was holes in the ground full of grain and then covered up and preserved, and it lasted. You know, it's dry over there anyway. There wasn't enough rain to spoil it anyhow, and now they have food. Not only do they have grain to make bread out of, they've got enough barley and enough straw and enough stuff for their animals to live on too. And people were coming. They were coming from all over the land, all out of Canaan down into Egypt, and they were looking for food because they didn't have any up there. So now we're up to where our story starts here today. Starts out in verse 3 of chapter 42, says, "And Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy corn in Egypt." 10 brothers. We remember the dysfunctional family, right? So you've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Those are Leah's sons, right? That's the sister that he got when he was supposed to be marrying Rachel. Then he had Gad and Asher. That's Leah's handmaid. That's theirs. Dan and Naphtali. That one is Rachel's maid, Bilhah. And then little Ben, right? And Joseph himself. So 10 of the brothers went to Egypt to get grain to come back with. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob sent not with his brethren, for he said, lest peradventure mischief befall him. He didn't say evil, he said mischief. It's been 20 years since Joseph went missing. These words would indicate that Jacob had an inkling in his mind that it was not an animal that took his son. He had an inkling in his mind that it was the mischief of the brothers. He didn't have any proof, because, you know, you got all the brothers coming back saying a wild animal got him and here's his coat. But in the back of his mind, I think he always had daddies know. Daddies know when the kids come and talk to you and they're telling you their version of the truth, you look at them and you say, okay, son, you going to stick with that? That's your story? You going to stick with that? We know. Just like mamas know. You know. Verse 5 says, the sons of Israel came to buy corn among those that came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Wasn't just Egypt having a famine. The whole area was shut down from the rain. From rain. There was no rain. God had shut the heavens. Along with everybody else, here come the 10 brothers. And they made the journey. They made the trek. Word had spread that there was food in Egypt. You know, when I remember back to the great toilet paper shortage of the 2020s, you knew where to go get toilet paper, didn't you? I mean, it was almost an unspoken thing. Somebody would put up on Facebook, toilet paper at Walmart, zoom, then it was gone. Toilet paper at Food City Dandridge, boom, it was gone. Dollar General's got 5 rolls left, and here the word gets around, right? The word had got around here. There was food in Egypt. You can eat if you go to Egypt. Now, Joseph was still in charge of everything, and he was not sending out caravans to feed the world. That wasn't what he was doing. He wasn't stealing from Egypt to feed everybody. He was letting the folks who would come and ask for help, he would sell it to them. And I'm convinced, in my mind anyway, I've not seen anywhere scripturally that says otherwise. I don't think he was price gouging either. I don't think that he was trying to sell a little bit for a whole lot. I think he was being honest and upfront. I think his business principles remained intact, and he was doing an honest thing for the people. He was honestly trying to help the people. Let's keep looking over here now. The brothers come, and you all know the story. I'm not going to try to rehash the whole story in detail. But the brothers came to Egypt to buy food. They saw Joseph. Joseph recognized them, but they did not recognize Joseph. He didn't identify himself to his brothers at this time either. Now, you ask yourself, perhaps, why didn't they recognize him? That was their brother. Well, Joseph was 17 years old-ish when they sold him off into slavery. He's now pushing 40. He's not wearing the garb of a shepherd. He doesn't have his multicolored dream coat on. He's wearing royalty. He is the last place that they expected to see Joseph was sitting on a throne dishing out stuff that they needed. So they wasn't looking for him, but he didn't look like their Joseph. This wasn't the little hunkered over boy crying for mercy out of the well or screaming to his brothers, don't sell me off into slavery. This was a proud man, a man of authority, dressed well, seated. I mean, he was on it. His attire was that of the grandest of Egypt. He was literally of the royal household. They didn't recognize him. It could be they didn't get close enough to recognize him too, because you didn't just walk up and touch the foot of the person. All right? You had this, I'm in my mind now, this big palace, hundreds if not thousands of people lined up out the door to get their food, and this fella up here looking down here, and all of the guards around and all of this, and quite honestly, you're not supposed to look at the Pharaoh. You're not supposed to look, even now in England and in other places, you kind of avert your eyes. You don't look royalty in the eye, okay? Just like you don't look an old hound dog in the eye because it's a challenge. Oh, you're going to look at me, okay. So they probably just kind of looked up there and diverted their glance. So they didn't look at him long enough to recognize him. He spoke through an interpreter. He didn't speak to them in their language. So they didn't recognize him. So here we go. He gives them food. You know how the story goes. He gives them some food, and he puts their money back in their sacks, and then he lets them go, and then they come back for more food a little bit later, and just all of this stuff going on, right? He has, they've come back now, and they've had to bring the youngest. They've had to bring the baby with them. Are we there yet? Wait a minute. Let me just read this for you right fast before I get too far ahead of myself here. And they said one to another, "We're very guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us." And Reuben, that's the oldest, answering them, saying, "Spake I not unto you, saying, do not sin against the child, and ye would hear not? Therefore, behold, also his blood is required." They knew not that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them by an interpreter, and he turned himself about from them and wept. So they had been in jail for 3 days at this point. They came in, and he accused them of being spies. He said, "Look, y'all are spies. You're not here from Canaan to buy stuff. You're here to see our weakness and report back to a king from the north somewhere. I'm going to put you in jail." He knew who they were. But he also wanted to see who they were at this point in their life. He knew who they used to be. So he put them in jail. And he said, "Nope, you stay down there for 3 days." They brought him back out of jail, and he told them, said, "Okay, everybody goes home but one. I'm going to keep one of you so that I know the others will come back," right? So the second oldest man, whose name was Simeon, right? Simeon, Joseph put him back in jail and said, "The rest of you can go, but I want you to prove to me what you're saying. You got to prove to me what you're saying." He just found out he had a little brother, because they had told him, we're the sons of this guy, and there's 11 of us. There was 12, but now there's 11. And he figured out, well, I was the youngest. That means I got a little brother if there's still 11 of them there. So he wanted a couple of things. I think in back of his mind, I don't know, I think he wanted to see his little brother, but I think he also wanted to see what his big brothers were like at this point. Because these are the same big brothers that were very willing to sell him off into slavery. But now he heard them talking, and he saw the genuine remorse. It's kind of one of those hot mic moments, when people are saying what they really mean instead of what they want you to hear. And they were talking, and they had this moment where Big Brother Benjamin was saying, "I told you not to hurt that child. Now you see, it's all come back to us. We sold him off to be a slave in Egypt, and now one of us has to stay in Egypt. I told you boys not to do that, and you did it anyway." Remember, Reuben was going to come back and rescue him out of the pit. "You would not hear, therefore behold, his blood is required." This is God's vengeance on us, boys. We earned this, is basically what he was telling them. Now, when Joseph heard that, it pricked his heart just a little bit, because he's seeing a change here. It's no longer, okay, let's take the least important one among us and leave them, and the rest of us will go back home and it's all good. They weren't turning on each other so quickly anymore. They had unified into a family unit where they were actually looking out for each other. It's incredible what you can learn after 20 years, isn't it? Even living in a dysfunctional family. Sometimes, even Jesus said about the Pharisees, look at the good stuff they do and do that. Take the good stuff that they do that. Just don't do the stupid stuff. I think they had probably figured that out. You learn to survive in a dysfunctional family. And, I guess every family has a somewhat dysfunction to it. And I'm sure growing up, we all thought that our family was probably the most mixed up, crazy family anywhere. since I've been teaching school for 17 years, I've seen that's not the case in my family. No, I don't believe that now. I see families that have no business being families. I see people that have every excuse to just explode, self-destruct, yet they are moving forward, right? And I see people from good, solid, traditional families that just spin out of control and self-destruct. So I think these guys, the brothers, had figured out how to survive together. I think I think every day they were living with guilt. I'm convinced that they had some serious PTSD going on. I mean, just to hear the scream of your brother being carried off in a caravan, I mean, that, if you are any kind of person at all, that's got to have an effect on you. And it did. And maybe that was a turning point for these brothers. Scripture doesn't tell me that. But something happened. Maybe seeing the anguish, the despair that they brought upon their father. Maybe living every day with the knowledge that they are personally responsible for crushing their father. Maybe that had some effect on them. Something did. But whatever it was real enough for Joseph to pick up on. And he kind of turned himself around so that they couldn't see him. And I can just see tears running down his face. The final little bit of scripture that we're going to look at today skips forward about three more chapters, I should say, forward, and we're in Genesis 45 now. He has sent the brothers back home and hidden their money in their sacks, and then he told them when he sent them home, he said, "Don't come back without your little brother." I think there's two things going on there. He wanted to see little brother, and he wanted to see if they were willing, and to see what was going to happen. So they all come back to get more food, because he only gave them as much as they could carry. He didn't, that's not a lot. When you're thinking about the household here, not just the 10 brothers. If I took me a tow sack full of grain, I could live on that for a minute. But if I took it home to the family, not so long, right? And even if I put a couple on each donkey, that still ain't that much when you go to thinking about all of the stuff that the family had. Now, during the drought, there's no doubt that a lot of that had withered up, literally. I'm sure a lot of the animals had succumbed to the drought. It was to such a point that they were willing to travel all the way to Egypt, days and days journey. So then Daddy tells him, said, "You got to go back and get more." The brothers tell him, and you know the story. I'm hitting the highlights of it here. The brothers tell Daddy, "I can't go back without little Benjamin, because he won't see us without little Benjamin. He told us, do not come back." And that's kind of the Pharaoh dude, and he'll, in fact, I think I remember reading that he told him, "You won't live if you come back without little brother." So Daddy finally succumbs and sends the young one back. I can only imagine what Daddy must have been feeling at that point. All the suspicions are still there. Daddy didn't learn much, unfortunately. Daddy's still showing favoritism. Daddy is still keeping little Benjamin at home. His beloved had died giving birth to him, but he was keeping him at home. He didn't get to go with the others. Because last time my favorite went with the others, he didn't come back. And I'm sure that, the learning curve for him was yet to come. He would learn it later on. So looking on up here, they came back, and you remember there was a feast. He made them a feast and fed them and sent them on their way again, but his porter put the silver cup in the youngest one, right? And sent them out, and they hadn't gone but just a little bit. And he sent after them, and he brung them all back. He said, "What is this evil that you've done for me?" And the brothers told him, said, "No, nuh-uh. We didn't do this time. This isn't us. And in fact, if you find it, then that person, you can kill him, and the rest of us will be your slaves." And there it was in little Benjamin's sack. Now, the old brothers would have said, "Well, sorry, Ben, we'll see you later." But these brothers interceded. Intervene's the wrong word. They couldn't get between the brother in Egypt and do any good, but they did intercede. And the brother begged Joseph, and he said, take me instead of him. And he made this amazing, beautiful speech about how his daddy would go to his grave miserable if anything happened to the youngest. They had they had made peace with the fact that Daddy had a favorite. They had made peace with the fact that they were not Daddy's favorite, but they were still a functional family. Even though, sometimes you have to love your family even though. Sometimes in order to move forward with what God has for us in this church, we have to love each other even though. And we follow God, because I tell you what, as much as I love Sister Mindy, I'm not here for her. If you are here for a person, then you're here for the wrong reason. If you're following God simply because Mom and Daddy told you to, you missed it. You're doing Thanksgiving alone. You got all of the right stuff, but none of the heart that goes with it. It's a good show, but it doesn't matter. Joseph was able to see now, after the brother had offered himself, let my little one go, don't destroy my father, take me, I will stand in for him. Take me instead. Verse 1 of chapter 45 goes on, Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood before him, and he cried, Cause every man to get out from me. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known to his brother. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. He wasn't just whimpering. He let it out. There has been times in my life, and I hope there has in yours, where you just could not contain it anymore. And you just had to cry out. And God talks in tears. He understands. He understands when you cry out to Him. When there's no words, that's when you're talking to God. When you just can't make the words, that's when God hears you. Better than ever. Because if we have all the eloquent words, and we have all the flowery language, and we make all the right movements at the certain time, and we inflect our voice at just the amount of time and that's a good show. But sometimes, I think when we're praying to God, He's holding His nose. Because we're putting on a show, see. He don't want no show. You worship in spirit and truth, right? And you pray in spirit and in truth. And truth, Granny said, truth stands when the world's on fire. Truth is all that there really is. Verse 3 goes on, And Joseph said to his brethren, I'm Joseph, does my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. He said, I am Joseph, is my father. Well, of course his father's alive. They told him all about father. But, there's just like, I'm sure that Joseph, over his 20 years in captivity and even after captivity, had wondered, how's Daddy? How's Daddy? Because, he was Daddy's favorite, and Daddy took care of him, and there was a special bond there. But he worried about Daddy. He thought about Daddy. He wondered about Daddy. Does my father yet live? His brethren couldn't answer him. They were troubled at his presence. They didn't know what to say. This guy who's been speaking through an interpreter to us for these last interactions here, he's suddenly speaking in our own tongue, and he sounds familiar. I know that voice. It's different when you're talking to somebody through an interpreter or on text. The kids today in their text, you can't hear the person. I don't know if it's that person texting me or somebody faking to be that person. The brothers didn't hear Joseph's voice. They were hearing the interpreter. Now they heard his voice, and it troubled them. Last time they heard that cry was the young man being carried off with the camels. And I'm sure that it just crushed their souls. It had to. It had to, because they had developed a conscience. They were sorry for what they did. I'm sure they had had nightmares over the young brother being carried off. They were troubled at his presence. And then Joseph said to them, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near. And he said, I am Joseph, your brother, who you sold to Egypt. He told him. He looked at him in the face. He's the only one who knew. There were no other witnesses that he had been sold. Everybody up in Canaan thought he had been killed. Except Daddy. He probably had suspicion. What kind of guilt must that have been on them? What kind of a crushing presence of guilt? I tell you what, when God makes you, when you feel guilty, when God puts a shame on you, brother, you feel it. Ooh, you feel it. You know that what you have done is dirty, nasty, sinful, and you have that presence of God just convicting you. These boys was convicted. And in their minds, they were convicted to death. Because they knew what they had done to him, and they could just imagine what he was about to do to them. But then he did something that nobody saw coming. And I think this is where the Lord stepped in, not for the first time, but this is God right here. This is fruit of being in the will of God. This is a manifest action to an indwelling presence of God and following God in your life. He said this, now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither. Don't have that remorse that you've carried for 30 years. Turn it loose. 3 most precious words that you'll ever hear is not I love you. It's not I forgive you. Because those are harder to say. If you've ever wronged someone and know it, you know it, and they've come to you and said, I forgive you, there's nothing more powerful than forgiveness. Isn't that how God shows us His ultimate love? Through forgiveness? Through canceling debt that we so desperately are guilty of. I forgive you. In fact, He used those words in a sense when He heals some people, thy sins be forgiven. Rise up and walk. Nor angry with yourselves. Quit beating yourselves up. You've suffered under your own sentence of guilt long enough. Let it go, I forgive you. Stop beating yourselves up. You sold me here But that next phrase, for God did send me. You think you sold me here. God sent me here. See, Joseph had realized that in all of the things that happened in his 40 years of life up to this point, he could look back from now, and I hope we can do this. I hope that today we can look back and we can see the places that we've come from, the addictions that God has taken us out of, the relationships that God has freed us from, the sin that no longer besets us as strongly as it did when we were teenagers or in our 20s or 30s, 40s, or 50s. That we've come to this side of the trial. There is coming a point of trial in every one of us' life. There comes trials to every person. After we get through them, we can look back. You know, we do a thing in my class in ROTC. Every time we do something, an event, we have an after-action review. We look back at it and we see what happened, what could have done better, what are we going to keep doing. I think with everything in our lives, if we would conduct an after-action review and look back, hey guys, come on in, that we would see God's hand moving. And if we're looking for God's hand, see, that's something that I've picked up on in my later years that I missed growing up, is looking for God's hand. And not saying, why me, God, why me? But God, what am I supposed to do with this? How can I use this for your glory? How can I take this simple thing and turn it into something about you? Always being able to relate anything back to Jesus, back to the salvation plan. Being able to look at everything in our life and focus it on God. Joseph had arrived. He could do that. He could do that. At this point, he was doing it in extreme comfort. But he had not, in that comfort, forgotten all of the things that got him there. His work ethic was still intact. He was, when people came to Pharaoh a few chapters before and said, hey, we're hungry, what are we supposed to do? What did Pharaoh say? Go see Joseph. His work ethic was there. He's the one giving out the grain. He was the one that oversaw it. His work ethic never failed. As we get to the other side, as we have a little bit more knowledge, stuff, money, whatever, we're at the point where we need to be looking at those younger than us, this group, and showing them how to properly utilize it. Maybe, for these guys, you work for a week at McDonald's and you get $100, and that's a good payout, right? I used to think it was really cool. I could work all day long in the hayfield and get a $20 bill, and I was set, man. It didn't take much more than that. I was good till the next hayfield. Now, not so much. I can do that at McDonald's in one stop. But I think that we need to show through our actions where God has brought us to. I'm sure that we can all, and I'm going to close right here with this, I'm sure we can all look back at our life and think of an old couple. Maybe when we're teenagers. And we look at that couple and that's what I want. And that's cool. But isn't it more cool when that old couple tells you how to be them? Isn't it more cool when they look at you and say, honey, it's 100 decisions a day to stay together. Honey, love is not this great little butterfly emotion where you get all jittery. That's not love at all. That's indigestion. What this is a commitment, right? That one was free. Okay. Guess I better quit there, hadn't I? All right. Guys, appreciate you coming, and look forward to seeing you next week. God bless you.
It's in the book, isn't it?
Yes.